and also the original founder of the Platypus Affiliated Society, which started here at SAIC back in 2006 as a reading group. Also at the University of Chicago at the same time. But has branched out in the meantime to a number of locations both in the United States and elsewhere. So I was asked to give this teach-in on a book that we published that I edited called Marxism in the Age of Trump that compiled essays that we published and public fora transcripts from panel discussions that we held on the topic of the crisis of neoliberalism and the left in the face of the election of Trump. We're anticipating a second edition of the book in time for the 2020 election next year that will include another couple of short pieces that I've written and published in the Platypus Review subsequent to the book coming out. And one of them has been handed out to you guys, Why I Wish Hillary Had Won. And the other is something brand new that I'm going to present tonight, which is Why Not Trump Again? So the book basically tracks between the end of 2015 and into 2017. Starts with an essay that I wrote for Platypus on the Sandernistas, on the primaries, on Bernie Sanders in the 2015-2016 Democratic Party primaries. And it follows through to the end, to a certain kind of conclusion. The millennial left is dead, which is about the phenomenon of everyone joining the DSA, which ended up having a major role, at least in terms of a media relations standpoint, in the midterms, in the 2018 congressional midterms last year, in which several, at least affiliated, if not full members of the DSA were elected to the US Congress, the squad. Right. So the theme of the book is the crisis of the left in the face of a change into a post-neoliberal era. In other words, that the left had become really habituated and used to a kind of resistance to neoliberalism over the course of the past generation, and was unprepared for the crisis of neoliberalism and really the end of neoliberalism and the movement into a post-neoliberal environment. And there are a couple of ways that we could talk about the post-neoliberal environment. The book, Marxism in the Age of Trump, focuses on the political phenomenon, namely the disarray of the major parties, the major capitalist parties in the United States. The Democratic Party, as evinced by Bernie Sanders' insurgent candidacy as an independent, as a non-Democrat, but running for the Democratic Party nomination and doing much better than people thought he would. And of course, the Republican Party in the form of Trump coming in and just hijacking the Republican Party. But this is also seen elsewhere. So in the Great Recession, anti-austerity protests of that era, you had the rise of Syriza in Greece and Podemos in Spain as challenges to the established parties, to the established capitalist parties. Of course, you had the Brexit vote in the UK, in other words, an anti-EU upsurge, if you will. And the EU is a major neoliberal political formation from the last historical era, of last generation, even though it has roots in the earlier period as the economic community, European economic community in the mid-20th century. So focusing on the political aspect in the book, especially as regards the left, because the left is a political phenomenon, I didn't really address, and our public fora in Platypus didn't address so much the changes in the socioeconomic landscape or in the economy that might come with post-neoliberalism. That's become more of a prominent phenomenon in the last few years, um, essentially the boom that we've seen, and that it's Trump's avowed strategy to try to leverage the dependence of the rest of the world on a U.S. recovery to renegotiate global trade, right? So he looked at the situation and he said, okay, the rest of the world is going to suffer just as the U.S. suffered from the Great Recession, but they're actually, the other countries are going to depend upon the U.S. to pull the world out of the Great Recession. So you see a delayed reaction in the Great Recession. It's impacted other parts of the world in a delayed manner after the United States. Similarly, the recovery will be delayed in the rest of the world as opposed to the United States. So that kind of aspect, the socioeconomic aspect, and a new kind of economic configuration of capitalism has not fully revealed itself yet, but is in the process of emerging now. So focusing on the politics, however, the crisis of neoliberalism impacted the Republican Party first, meaning Trump was successful where Sanders was not. So Trump was successful with respect to overturning the Reagan coalition in the Republican Party, but Sanders was not so successful at dislodging the kind of neoliberal coalition, the Obama coalition, or before that, the Clinton coalition, the electoral coalition that the Democrats relied upon. So Hillary was still able to mobilize enough of that in the primaries to prevent Sanders from winning the nomination. And of course now it's very unclear what might happen with the Democrats, meaning they're just sort of grasping for whatever they can to try to put back together the Obama coalition. Whereas Trump is actually trying to change the electorate for the Republican Party. The left, of course, and I put the left in scare quotes, because as you guys know, Platypus says, the left is dead, long live the left, but really the left is dead. The left is oriented as a kind of fringe phenomenon to the Democratic Party and is oriented towards the various elements of the Democrats' electoral coalition. In other words, they're oriented towards minority community constituencies and towards the organized labor movement, the existing unions. And as such, then, the left is completely subject to the same crisis that the Democratic Party itself is subject to. So, for instance, in the 2016 election, you had the labor unions endorsing Hillary, but their members, at least enough of them, still voting for Trump, right? So you had the labor bureaucracy, the organized labor movement, endorsing the Democrats as usual, of course. They're not going to endorse the Republicans. But the membership not being as readily mobilizable as an electorate, especially in the Midwest. So the left, of course, has been thrown into something of a crisis with respect to its ideology. In other words, to be the left of the Democratic Party, which was the default position for the last 40 years, but has only become really very explicit in the context of the DSA, in the context of the hard kind of Marxist left, whether Trotskyist or Maoist, joining the DSA, which means really giving up any pretense to being independent of the Democratic Party. And the DSA itself finds itself split in the same way the Democratic Party is split, meaning all the old issues from the new left in the 1960s have returned, namely class versus race, gender, and sexuality. Right, so in other words, are we going to be, like class-oriented, or are we going to be oriented towards oppressed groups? Right, so anti-oppression versus anti-exploitation has emerged as the usual fault line for the Democrats, and therefore for the left, and for the DSA as well. Okay, so what I wanted to do by way of just putting some stuff out there for us to discuss is read two very short pieces. One is Why I Wish Hillary Had Won, which was written ahead of the 2018 midterm elections, and the other, which I have not handed out to you guys, which is Why Not Trump Again. So let's start with Why I Wish Hillary Had Won. So originally, I presented this last year in 2018. At the Left Forum in New York City, which is a major North American conference of the left, at a panel hosted by the Marxist Humanist Initiative on the danger of left Trump-ism, is what they called it. And I was invited to speak on the panel as someone that they could criticize for the article that I had written in 2016, Why Not Trump? So this is what I had to present in response to their criticism of me. So Why I Wish Hillary Had Won. As a Marxist academic professional and a gay man living in a northern city, married to a non-white Muslim immigrant, it would have been beneficial to me for Hillary Clinton to have been elected president of the United States. That would have served my personal interests, no doubt about it. I am opposed to all of Trump's policies. I'm especially opposed to Trump on his signature issue, immigration. But I was opposed to Obama on this as well. And I would have been opposed to Hillary too. I am opposed to DACA and its hierarchy of supposedly deserving recipients. Full citizenship rights for all workers. One response to Trump's Make America Great Again was a Mexican nationalist slogan, Make America Mexico Again. But as a Marxist, I go one step further. I am for the union of Mexico and the United States under one government, the dictatorship of the proletariat. But Trump made Rudy Giuliani and Jeff Sessions wear hats saying, Make Mexico Great Again also. This was wholly sincere, at least on Trump's part, but probably also for Sessions and Giuliani. Why not? If I am opposed to making America great again, then I suppose I am also opposed to making Mexico great too. For the purposes of the struggle for socialism I seek to pursue, I wish Hillary had won the election. All the anti-Trump protest going on is a distraction from the necessary work. And worse, Trump feeds discontent into the Democrats as the party of opposition. With Hillary in office, this would have been less the case. However, we must remember that, had she won, Hillary still would have faced a Republican majority in Congress, and so we would still have heard about how important it would be to elect Democrats last year in the 2018 congressional midterms. I am opposed to Trump's law and order conservatism. Not that I am against law and order per se, mind you, and perhaps I am not even so opposed to the order and law of society as it is now. I play by the rules and follow the law. Why wouldn't I? And anyway, honestly, who here doesn't? Rebels all. But I'm aware that laws are selectively enforced and that the social order is run by those who don't always play by the rules, don't always play by their own rules. I am aware that the social order and the law are used as excuses for things that are not so lawful and orderly, for things that are not so social. I am aware of Trump's demagogy. But it is funny watching the established social and political order go into fits over Trump's insistence on law and order. Trump's election gave the left something to do. They should be grateful. They would have been bored under Hillary. Especially after 8 years of Obama, fascism is much more exciting, isn't it? I would have been grateful if Hillary had been elected instead. Saturday Night Live's jokes about Hillary are much funnier than about Trump. My family voted for Trump, mostly. My mother and my brother and his wife voted for Trump. My father voted for Hillary. When Hillary collapsed due to fatigue from pneumonia, my father dutifully went to get his pneumonia shot. But my mother previously had voted twice for Obama. I'm not sure if my father did too. He might have voted for McCain and Romney. In the primaries, I intended to vote for Bernie, but it turned out the Democrats sent the wrong ballots to my precinct, which was more likely to vote for Bernie than other precincts. I thus personally witnessed in action the Democrats' suppression of votes for Bernie in the primaries. So I went to the empty Republican line and voted for Trump. In November, too. I knew that Hillary would win Illinois, but I wanted her to win by 1 vote less. No sense rewarding the Democrats for being greedy. I expected Trump to win. From the very moment that Trump descended the golden escalator and announced his candidacy, I thought he could win. As time went on, I increasingly thought that he would win. I had mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, I dreaded this shit show that ensued in Trump's campaign and that I knew would only get worse if he was elected. But on the other, I felt an obligation as a teacher to prepare my students for Trump's victory. If he had not won, nothing would have been lost. My students didn't require any special preparation for a Clinton presidency. But if Trump won, I knew that there would be a great deal of confusion and scaremongering by the Democrats. I couldn't stand by and watch my students be lied to. I had lived through the Reagan Revolution and watched The Day After on television along with everyone else. That's the nuclear Third World War little mini-series. I heard Reagan denounced as a fascist by the left and experienced the multiple anticlimaxes of Mondale and Dukakis. The world hadn't ended. As an adult, I lived through the George W. Bush presidency, 9/11 and the War on Terror, the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, the financial crisis, and the change we can believe in, the election of the first black president. In all that time, not much had changed, at least not much attributable to the presidency. So I didn't expect much to change with Trump either. But I did expect a lot of hysterics in response. I knew that my students would be scared. I wanted to protect them from that. So I sought to get out ahead of it. My students asked me to write a statement on the election in the beginning of the new academic year. This is September of 2016. Something short that could be handed out as a flyer. So I wrote, "Why not Trump?" It was not an endorsement nor an equivocation, but an honest question. Why not Trump? Perhaps it was too philosophical. As I wrote in that article, I thought that the mendacity of the status quo defending itself against Trump was a greater threat than Trump himself. I was prompted to reread Hannah Arendt's article on the Pentagon Papers, Lying in Politics. She said that the ability to lie was inextricably connected to the ability to create new things and change the world. I don't know. I did find, however, a difference in quality and character between Trump's lies and the Democrats. The only argument I found for Hillary was that we lived in the best of all possible worlds, as Voltaire's Professor Pangloss described it in Candide. I didn't want to be Professor Pangloss. I wanted to spare my students that. But perhaps we did live in the best of all possible worlds under Obama, and would have continued to do so under Hillary. Perhaps Trump really has ruined everything for everyone. Perhaps the world has come to an end. I don't know. I wish Hillary had won so I could have found out. All right, so that was from last year. And now I'll bring it up to date. I wanted to play a song, but instead you'll just get the name. So why not Trump again? Kanye West famously indicted President George W. Bush for not caring about black people. Mr. West now says that it's the Democrats who don't care about black people. But he thinks that Trump does indeed care. West, who received an honorary doctoral degree from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago a few years ago, intends to move back to Chicago from Hollywood, which he describes as the sunken place. You guys know that reference? Get Out? Yes? Okay, sunken place. West's wife, Kim Kardashian, convinced President Trump to free Alice Johnson, a black grandmother, from jail, and to initiate the criminal justice sentencing reform legislation called the First Step Act. Prisoners are being released to join the workforce, in which the demand for labor has been massively increased in the economic recovery under the Trump administration. The reason for any such reform now, after the end of the Great Recession, will be this demand for workers, no longer the need to warehouse the unemployed. Trump ran on and won election calling for jobs, 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 and now defines his Republican Party as standing for, quote, the right to life and the dignity of work, which was his definition of what Make America Great Again meant to him. This will be the basis now for his re-election in November 2020, for promises kept. The current impeachment farce, I was just watching this today and have been watching it, unfortunately, is indeed what Trump calls it. The Democrats motivated by outrage at his exposure of their shameless political corruption, with the Biden family prominently featured. After trouncing the infamous Clintons in 2016, Trump is keeping this drumbeat going for 2020. Don't expect it to stop. The Democrats have wanted to impeach Trump from the moment he was elected. Indeed, even beforehand, but finally got around to it when Trump exposed them, exposed their frontrunner. Trump has held out the offer of bipartisan cooperation on everything from trade to immigration reform. He went so far as to say, when congratulating the Democrats on their 2018 midterm election victories, that he would be potentially more able to realize his agenda with a Democrat majority Congress, because he would no longer have to face resistance from established mainstream Republicans opposed to his policies. In his State of the Union address to Congress this year, Trump contrasted the offer of negotiation and cooperation with the threat of investigations. As it turns out, the FBI, CIA, and other US government security services personnel who have tried to indict Trump out of political opposition are now finding themselves the targets of criminal investigation. At least some of them are likely to go to prison. The bloated national security state is dismayed and in retreat in the face of Trump. Good. What is the argument against Trump's re-election? That he is utterly unbearable as a president of the United States? That Trump must be stopped because the world is running out of time, either in terms of the time spent by separated children being held under atrocious conditions in appalling immigration detention facilities, or that of glaciers falling into the ocean. Both of these will continue unabated, with or without Trump. The Democrats neither can nor will put a stop to such things, not even slow them. What is the argument for electing the Democrats then? A Green New Deal will never happen. Obama promised it already in 2008. That they will restore civility to American life, like we had under Obama? In other words, the same conditions, but with a comforting smile instead of an irritating smirk. But Trump supporters became annoyed with Obama and have been reassured by Trump's confidence in America. Trump's smile is not sarcastic. Obama's often was. Don't the Democrats deserve that grin? Will the Democrats provide free, quality health care for all? Not on your life. Neither will Trump. But not because he doesn't want to. He definitely does. He thinks that it's absurd that the wealthiest country in world history cannot provide for its citizens. But what can you do? The last time national health care was floated as a proposal was by Nixon, but it was defeated by Democrats as well as Republicans. Nixon floated UBI, Universal Basic Income, as well, but it was opposed by the Democrats, especially by their labor unions, who rightly said that employers would use it as an excuse to pay workers that much less. Abortion was legalized when fewer workers were needed. It happened at a certain time in history for a reason. But that was a different time, before the general economic downturn after 1973 that led to the last generation of neoliberalism, austerity, and a society of defensive self-regard and pessimism. Now, it is likely we are heading into a new generation-long period of capitalist growth and optimism. At least it's possible. Nixon and Mao agreed that, quote, what the left proposes, we, the right, push through. Are we on the brink of a new post-neoliberal progressive era then? Don't count on it, at least not with the Democrats. Probably, they won't let their presidential nominee next year be Bernie Sanders. Probably, they won't even let it be Warren either. And anyway, after Obama, no one is really going to believe them. Even if Bernie were to be elected president, he would face a hostile Democratic Party, as well as Republicans in Congress. It's unlikely the squad of AOC and the rest will continue to be reelected at all, let alone expand their ranks of Democratic Socialists in elected office. The DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, have already peaked, even before the thankless misery of canvassing for Democrats, not socialists, in the next election. The future belongs not to them, but to Chinese Communist Party General Secretary Xi Jinping, hosted by Trump at Mar-a-Lago. Climate change must be stopped by China. The arguments against Trump by the Democrats have been pessimistic and conservative, distrustful and even suspicious of American voters, to which he opposes an unflappable confidence and optimism based in faith in American society. Trump considers those who vote against him to be mistaken, not enemies. But the Democrats considered Trump voters to be inimical, deplorable and irredeemable. My Muslim friends who oppose Trump, half of them support Trump, said that after his election in 2016, they found their neighbors looking at them differently. Suspiciously. But I think it made them look at Americans differently, suspiciously. But it's the same country that elected Obama twice. If Trump's America is really the hateful place Democrats paint it to be, for instance, at their LGBTQ CNN town hall that they had, I think a month ago or maybe a month and a half ago, at which protesters voiced the extreme vulnerability of trans women of color, then it must be admitted that such violence is perpetrated primarily not by rich, straight white men, as much as by cisgendered heterosexual men and women of color. Should we keep them in jail? The Democrats' only answer to racism, sexism, and homophobia is to fire people and put them in prison, whereas Trump lets them out of jail to give them a job. Perhaps their getting a job will help us too. So, why not Trump again? And do you have another? All right, so that was meant to be a little provocative, of course. A little provocative. I hope not massively provocative, but maybe it was, who knows. Q&A.
I have a question. Just curious, if this piece ends up being, or with what you just said, ends up being published, do you foresee yourself in 2 years having to write a why I wish Biden or Bernie or Warren had one response to it? Or do you think there's something qualitatively different about
maybe
Trump this time than in 2016?
Oh, no. Well, okay, so a point would be, I'm not contradicting myself. Right? So that's the challenge, right? The challenge is, I think Trump could win again, right? I thought he could win the first time. I think he could win again, even with all the crazy shit show that it's been. And so the question is, why? Right? In other words, what's the explanation that people have for why he won the first time? And what's the explanation that they'll have for why he might win a second time? And for me, my task is to address that. In other words, how is it that Trump has the appeal that he has? Why do people vote for him? All that stuff. which is actually quite different from what the Democrats will tell you or what the left will tell you, because the left are just a subsidiary kind of market testing at best for the Democrats. So in other words, there's a real phenomenon, Trump's election, and then there are explanations for it. And of course, those explanations are self-serving on the part of the Democrats. They're also self-serving on the part of the left. So for me to say there's a difference between endorsing something and recognizing it, right? In other words, and that might be a challenge too, is that we might live in a world where to say that something exists is to somehow affirm it, right? Because, obviously Trump's a symptom of something, and, a historical phenomenon, a real phenomenon, something, again, maybe initially after the election, and maybe a lot of people still at a psychological level treat it this way, as an accident, as an aberration. So the question is, okay, was it entirely accidental, or is there more to it than that? And so I think that we're tasked with treating it as something more than merely accidental. In which case, we have to get into the reasons, and to explain the reasons, or to at least question the reasons, is not the same thing as to say that it's good, right? So that's the Candide point, right? Pangloss, right? The world is just as it should be. Well, as a leftist, of course, I don't believe that. Right? I do not believe that the world is as it should be. And yet it is what it is. Right? I mean, maybe that is the philosophical challenge. Like, can you say that something is something without saying that that's the way it should be? So will I wish that we don't have another 4 years of Trump after he's reelected? Probably. I will wish that, sure. But that won't change anything. Meaning nothing that I say here now is going to change what happens next November at all. Zero. That will have no impact whatsoever. So the only thing that it can impact is our mindset when it happens. Right? That's the issue. What's our mindset in the face of reality? Because I myself have no power over what millions of Americans do voting. Nor do I seek to have that power, right? Even if I could influence people, I wouldn't want to.
I'm curious, do you still think it's more of a distraction that Trump won, and if that will be the case if Trump wins again?
That is a good question. In other words, an obstacle to like socialist politics. Yes. However, and so in what way, right? In what way? In the way that I laid out, which is to say that it channels opposition into the Democratic Party, it channels all socialism and Marxism into the DSA, which for me is just a dead end. A priori, no way. It's just not going anywhere. So in that sense, it does cause people to react. Now, that's the more subjective aspect. In other words, dealing with people's ideology. So people feel that there's no alternative than the lesser of two evils or whatever, right? However they'll rationalize it, because the DSA will endorse whomever in the end. They'll probably endorse Biden if Biden probably won't even make it. But anyway, so there's that. There's the other aspect, which I mentioned earlier, which is post-neoliberalism. Meaning, if we have a new economic boom that continues, if there are new forms of employment that come out of the crisis of the service and information economy and yield some new configuration of capitalism, that's an opportunity. That's an actual opportunity for organizing. I doubt that the left will be able to take advantage of that, but it's at least an opportunity. So in that sense, Trump's not an obstacle. And also, in that sense, it doesn't really matter who's elected next year at all, right? Because that's going to be the case regardless. You know, in other words, I'm not saying that Trump is responsible for the recovery at all, but he's going to claim responsibility for it, and people are going to vote for him on that basis.
Thanks. I don't disagree with you. Like, he's on track to win the way the establishment Democratic Party is treating the entire impeachment and then some. And then, of course, there's the fact that, like, the stock market's at all-time high, and you know, he has passed the tax cut for all the corporations to, you know, extend the inequality.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, like, you just kind of have to go with the Democratic option at this point, because they're going to be, even if socialists don't win power, left doesn't win power, it's up to the left to push that nominee to make sure that wealth redistribution can happen. Like, I think that's like, and that's not going to solve like imperialism and all these other problems.
No, right.
But like, it's just if you just kind of decrease the gap of wealth, then like maybe certain contradictions subside, and we don't have as much of like a potential like chaotic explosion of things.
Possibly. I mean, I would say a couple of things about that. So remember that Obama promised that. And remember also that the real opportunity for that was the Great Recession. In other words, that was an actual crisis of capitalism that called for a response. And now that's not the case, right? So the thing with the billionaires, you know, poor Bernie, right, is the billionaires don't consume billions, right? Like, in other words, like being a billionaire, that's not a gauge of like a better lifestyle, right? In other words, you only have to make a certain amount to have the lifestyle of a billionaire. Other than that, that money is all just investment capital. In other words, they have an army of experts who decide how to invest it. It's not like they themselves even choose. And they themselves don't run their companies either, right? Very few of them do. Some of them do, but mostly they don't. The Democratic Party is the party of management. They're also the party of Wall Street. But let's leave that aside. Let's pretend that the Democratic Party was not the party of Wall Street. Let's say that Elizabeth Warren or Bernie became the nominee and they kicked out all the Wall Street people. Let's say that they got all the Reagan Democrats who became Clinton Democrats, who became Obama Democrats, who became Trump Democrats. Let's say that all of them voted for Bernie or Warren. And so you change the electoral landscape back to a more typical New Deal coalition type complexion. And you scare away all the Wall Street people and they flee to the Republican Party. Let's say that happens. And so the Democrats have to answer to the working class in terms of being reelected. Okay? That doesn't change the fact that the Democrats are the party of management. In other words, you can scare away the billionaires, you can scare away the hedge fund people, but they're still the party of management. And the party of management, what do they have to do? In other words, they have to attract capital. And to attract capital, they have to do what they do, which is exploit the working class, right? So in terms of wealth redistribution, you know, the whole 1% business and the whole billionaire thing, it's not as if you take the billionaire's money and just give it to the working class. Like, that's not, like, that, firstly, that's not really going to happen, but also that's not the problem with capitalism either. So what you'll get from someone like Bernie, you won't get it from Warren. You'll get it a little bit from Warren. She'll say you need ethical capitalism. She'll say that we need to model American capitalism more like Western European capitalism, where you have like workers on the board of corporations with a say, like unions with a seat at the table, like basically going back to a kind of 50s and 60s model. She'll say that, and Bernie will say, well, of course we need a movement, right? In other words, we not only need to elect me, but of course he doesn't even expect to be elected. So there's also that. He doesn't even expect to be elected, right? So his whole point is to try to gin up a movement, but really to expand the Democrats' electoral base. In other words, his point in 2015, 2016 was to appeal to people who aren't normally appealed to by the Democrats, to win over independents, right? That's his thing. So what's meant by movement there is, again, trying to make the Democrats more dependent on a different electoral base. But let's say that we go with we need a movement. Obama said the same thing. He said, I won't be able to do anything in office without a movement to support me and to push me. Right? So
just
that's
to follow up,
go
when
ahead.
you say because of Trump winning, more, especially young people are much more aware and active than they were in 2008?
I don't know. I mean, I was there in 2008. Platypus started in 2006, and we were very much engaged with the left. And my sense of it was that the left was pretty big. In other words, the anti-war movement was pretty big. The new SDS was pretty big. It seems like the DSA might be bigger than the new SDS was in terms of like an activist movement, but I'm not sure because, of course, the DSA just has its paper membership, right? And the protests, like the science, like the Women's March, the science, that's just rank Democratic Party stuff and just people showing up at a protest, and that's not like a movement either. So, there is that question. There's a question of, okay, are people getting politicized? Now, here's the thing. Was Trump's election good for that? Right? To prompt a reaction. But then the question is, well, what kind of reaction? In other words, what's the reaction to? Like, what's the actual substance of the reaction? What's the basis of discontent? The other thing that happened in 2006, besides the founding of the new Students for a Democratic Society out of the anti-war movement, was the immigration rights protests in the United States that were huge, big, and disappeared. So do you guys know why they disappeared? Because the Democrats turned them off. Right? They have an on-off switch for these things. Right? It's the same reason why the anti-war movement disappeared when Obama was elected. So, according to that argument, we should have Trump again to keep the movement going. Right? Yeah, sorry to be so, disenchanted or whatever, like Debbie Downer or I don't know what. But I don't know if the Zoomers are better than the millennials, right? At this point, right? Because it did seem, for instance, there was more of a claim to, Marxism of a certain kind around 2008 than there is now. Again, the Great Recession was an opportunity. The other opportunity circa Obama's election was the war on terror. That was a debacle. And one thing that we have to admit is that Trump's the anti-war candidate. He's the anti-war candidate. So if you want to know the predictability of counties voting for Trump, the counties that vote for Trump, the most clear predictor in terms of statistics is military families. So where military families are concentrated most are the counties that go for Trump the most. And not out of pro-war sentiment, but out of fatigue from the wars, out of the devastation of the wars. And of course, that's what all these crazy pardons are about now, right? Where he gets to talk about the deep state, the Pentagon is the deep state, right? And they're like punishing our noble warriors for whatever, fighting wars that they should never have been fighting to begin with. He does say that. He says, you're going to put people in jail now for wars that they should never have even gone over for, right? Because he says the Iraq War was the worst mistake in American history, except for maybe Vietnam. So he says Vietnam and Iraq, and he also lumps Afghanistan in, right? In other words, he kind of doesn't really say anything about the invasion of Afghanistan in response to 9/11, but he definitely says they shouldn't be occupying, that the U.S. shouldn't be occupying. That's huge. That's huge. So He's the anti-neocon, anti-war, anti-neoliberal candidate that Obama was supposed to be. So I mentioned my family who voted for Obama twice and then voted for Trump. And will vote for Trump again. They definitely will vote for him again. What do they say about Obama? He was a disappointment. Such a big disappointment. That's what they say. Obama was such a big disappointment. So what was he a disappointment on? All this shit. By the way, my family's working class. Anyway, just whatever. You know, I don't like to talk about that kind of thing, but just as like a sample, right? They are your Reagan Democrat type people. They're your swing voters, and what that means working class.
Hi. Can you just explain more why the Green New Deal wouldn't work? I mean, or wouldn't be implemented? Is it just like not too realistic, or?
Well, they say it's aspirational, right? And I feel like aspirational means like you know, like expirational. It's like, right, aspiration, like I'm having a hard time breathing. So they say that it's aspirational. They treat it as a negotiating position, right? In other words, they set targets. I don't think that it couldn't work. The question is, would it happen? In other words, is there a political will to do it, right? Can you get majorities in the US Congress to vote for it? You know, reality, like actual stuff. No. Right? No. So the Obama administration, unlike Trump, who's tweeting nonstop, the Obama administration was the most secretive administration ever in the history of the United States. And so with the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the treaty on blah, 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 something or other with the Europeans, TPIP or something. So it's not TPP, it's something else. And the Paris Accords. So the Obama administration demanded of all their negotiating partners, demanded of the Asian countries, and demanded of the EU that they not publish the protocols, that they not publish the agreements. And what they said was, because the public won't understand them, and all that you'll do is create controversy, and the public will reject, right? So, and that's, of course, something that just is grist for the mill for all these populists, right? I don't really like the term populist, but, you know, Trump is not alone in the world. Like in Europe, you see a lot of right-wing reaction against neoliberal technocracy. So, you know, the Green New, like in other words, what Obama promised in 2008 was a Green New Deal, meaning that he promised that the US government would subsidize industries in such a way so that when the US recovered out of the Great Recession, it would do so on a more green basis. In other words, that you would have a kind of retooling of American industry and et cetera. And basically offered it as government subsidy to make the US more competitive, because otherwise China and Europe will be the pioneers of green technology and all that stuff. So certainly all of that could happen, right? In other words, there's no reason why not. There's no reason why that can't happen. But the political will does seem to be lacking, right? That's really the issue. And there's also, you know, so I got my PhD from the University of Chicago, and they're famous for publishing a book there, the economists at the University of Chicago, called Freakonomics, right, where they talk about like how paradoxical economic outcomes happen from policies. And I was reading something recently that had a very Freakonomics kind of quality to it, which is the idea that maybe we need to burn more carbon in the short term in order to burn less carbon in the long term. And what they had in mind were specifically the developing economies. So countries like Bangladesh and India and China, in other words, might go through this period of pumping out a lot of carbon until they reach a standard of living where the population growth starts to taper, right? In other words, there's this idea that like as people become more prosperous, they have less children, and so population plateaus, but that the only way that you can get to that point is to go through an industrialization phase, and of course that means burning a lot of fossil fuels, right? So the idea is that, well, we might have to deal with like some, still kind of a lot of carbon burning in the short term in order to get to a point in 50 or 100 years when the population levels off and where technology catches up and all these things. So the capitalists are already thinking about this, right? And not only the capitalists in terms of like private investors and companies, but the politicians, right? So at a just global geostrategic level and also at a national level, people are thinking about this. And so it just becomes a matter of, what was the science march? Like climate denial or something. It becomes like belief. Like, do you believe in climate change or something, right? Which is a kind of silly culture wars kind of way of putting things. So, I think a Green New Deal could be done, but it's just unlikely, which of course I put very provocatively as not going to happen because it probably won't happen. So might as well get used to it. Right? In other words, I have students, of course, who are like, we don't have time, right? Like, in other words, it's like Trump has to be voted out because in 12 years, like, the world is going to come to an end. And it's like, well, first of all, the world is not going to come to an end. What's going to happen is things are going to get really shitty for the poorest people in the world. But the world will not end. In other words, the world ending would be like good, right? Because it would mean like an end to human suffering. But that's not going to happen, right? In other words, what's going to happen is we're going to plumb new depths of human suffering, right? We're going to find out just how much humans can take, right? That's what's going to happen. And it's just going to happen. That's going to happen. In other words, it's over. It's not like, in 12 years. It's over. It's over. It's done. It's over. Past the tipping point, over. There's no going back, right? It's going to be mass migration and flooding, and it's going to be, all of that is going to happen. And the capitalists are going to make money off of it. And new technologies are going to be developed out of it, and new forms of employment are going to come out of it. And wars will come out of it. What we've seen the last 200 years of capitalism will continue. Yes, that will happen. The question for me, as a Marxist, is how can we make socialism happen out of that? Because all that's going to happen, regardless. The question is, can there be socialism at the end of it? That's the only question. And that has nothing to do with whether Trump or the Democrats get elected next year.
This is from our live stream. Somebody has a question.
Oh, good.
What's posed is the choice of favorability of Trump as to help with clarifying the deadness of the left in their default orientation to the Democrats, or the favorability of the Democrats, people like Hillary, not necessarily Bernie, with helping with liberal organizing in civil society for any avowed socialist party, so that the left is not only concentrating their energies on fighting the right, but positively towards the task of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Pitching the choice in a black and white fashion, which is favorable. And if 1989 has posed the death of both Stalinism and Trotskyism, how does 2020 add to 2016's posing of the death of both the Harrington, Miliband, Rustin realignment strategy and accelerationism?
Holy shit. Okay, that's a lot of references. So in the larger world, but also among my students, I tend to experience this, that Marxism is understood as accelerationist, right? Now, there used to be another term before accelerationism. There was a term called worseism, right? In other words, that the left could be worsest, meaning that they wanted things to get worse to benefit the left. So a famous example of this is the German Communist Party in 1933 said, after Hitler, us. Meaning Hitler will come to power and things will get so bad that people will turn to us, right? Communists. And then we'll have a revolution. That didn't happen, right? But it was plausible. That was plausible. That was definitely plausible. So I wouldn't put this in terms of what's a more favorable outcome next year in terms of the left. Because first of all, there is no left. Dead, dead, dead. There's no left. So the question is really post-neoliberalism. Meaning, and by the way, I'm sure that there are DSAers who are thinking about this, that it might be good for them, for the Democrats to lose next year, because it will punish the right-wing Democrats and it will make the Democratic Party go further to the left. I'm sure that, in other words, they're not going to say that, because that will be the end of them. In other words, then the Democrats will wipe them out if they said that. But I'm sure that they're thinking it. I don't think that, right? In other words, I don't think that, well, first of all, what I mentioned, which is I don't think we're on the brink of a new progressive era. I don't think the circumstances are right for that. In other words, the actual progressivism of the early 20th century was in fact based on the threat of socialism. That simply doesn't exist now. In other words, what socialism means now is certain capitalist policies over other capitalist policies. What socialism meant in the early 20th century at the time of Theodore Roosevelt was a working class that you could not control. Right, a working class that was organized and that was just not available to be put under control. That's what the threat meant. And that's not the case now. In other words, there is no mass socialist party or civil society type organizing that is actually a threat. I think that when Obama said to the Wall Street people, it's between me and the pitchforks, meaning he was like, you know, if you don't listen to me, the pitchforks are coming for you. That was not about like class struggle or anything else or socialism. That's about the petty bourgeoisie run amok, meaning that's like your Tea Party type people. You know, your kind of whatever middle class, whatever you want to call them, people, which are a lot of the Trump voters, by the way. So in terms of a progressive, a neo-progressivism, because I've had to reckon with it, right? The idea that out of the Great Recession and out of the disarray of neoliberalism, the crisis of neoliberalism, the disarray of the Democratic Party, the disarray of the Republican Party, could come a new progressive era in capitalist politics, a kind of progressive capitalism, a kind of capitalist reformism. It seems that the only like actual viable force for that right now has been Trump, meaning he's the one who's actually renegotiating these trade arrangements and this kind of thing. Now, the Democrats could conceivably have that. They could do that. I just don't think it's very likely. Does the DSA have an active realignment strategy the way people like Michael Harrington and Bayard Rustin and others in the 60s, in the New Left era, had a kind of a plan for what to do with the New Deal coalition, to kick out the Dixiecrats, to make them join the Republican Party, and to switch the black vote from historically Republican to Democrat, and have basically a labor and black party as the Democratic Party. That was their plan. What they didn't anticipate, of course, was the decimation of the labor movement that came with neoliberalism. In other words, the reconfiguration of capitalism, which wasn't just like a union-busting effort. It was the deindustrialization of the United States. In other words, the old labor organizations were based on forms of employment that became obsolete. That's what really happened. So I don't think that we're in a moment now, And I don't think that they were in a moment then. In other words, the realignment strategy that people, the forerunners of the current DSA, like Michael Harrington, had in mind in the 60s, I don't think that was a plausible strategy then. It's even less of a plausible strategy now. Right? Because then it was based on full employment. It was based on much greater levels of unionization in the private sector. It was based on a different set of circumstances. And those are lacking. Those factors are lacking now. So again, in comparison to the 60s moment and in comparison to the early 20th century moment, the kind of old left moment and the kind of ancient Marxist moment and the new left moment, we're even in a less propitious position now than they were then, is what I would say. In other words, hypothetically, we could have a progressive era. Realistically, unlikely.
So this is a broader question about how changes that could have been led by the left, or a left, since the crisis of neoliberalism, have not been led by the left, but have instead been led by the right, in the form of Brexit, Trump, and now Boris Johnson in the UK. So the question is, what is the role of Marxists in the face of that in the 21st century? So moving forward, what ought Marxists to do?
All right, so I would say that, I have my own ideological biases, namely Marxism. The left is broader than Marxism, right? So at a more general level, at the level of the left, I think that what the left needs to do is completely independent of what happens in elections. Completely independent of what happens in elections. And so I think that the only possibility for a real left, not a dead left, to emerge is to completely divorce itself from the elections completely, and also from the culture of the Democratic Party. In other words, the middle class culture that the Democratic Party represents. So you would need to organize people across all the culture wars divisions that exist. So you'd have to completely disregard, because I think like actual working class people don't really live this way, don't live in these cultural compartments the way the middle class does in terms of ethical consumerism of various kinds and taste communities and this kind of thing. I don't think that people live that way, really. And so, yeah, you'd have to break people, activists, because of course activists are these middle class people, right? In other words, activists are the people who will just become professional politicians or become what's called the professional managerial class, right? They'll be the ethical capitalists. They're trained to become the management and to enforce a different code of labor discipline. So, diversity, sensitivity training, all of that stuff. That's all like management stuff. And of course, that's what I'm here as a professor to do. In other words, as a professor at the School of the Art Institute, I'm trained to train a generation of people to join corporate management. In other words, that's what the culture of this school is about. It's about educating students in a middle class management culture. Right? A real left would have to have nothing to do with that at all. Right, would have to completely be independent of academic culture, middle class culture, the Democrats, but also the Republicans. So I always like to say that Paul Ryan, right, who was one of these chagrined Republicans in the face of Trump, he's a kind of like Tea Party Republican, but not really, but he's like an Ayn Randist. Who knows where these people come from, really? Although, of course, I know exactly where they came from. Because I feel like I went to high school and college with them, at least at some level. But he once condemned Trump for making one of Trump's anti-Trump-isms, one of his remarks, he said, that's a textbook example of racism. And I said, that's a turn of phrase, right? Textbook example of racism. But actually, it's literally true. In other words, Paul Ryan learned from a textbook what racism is. Right? And he's like, oh, that fits the text. Like, in other words, the kind of management manual on racism, it's like, you're not supposed to talk that way. It says right here in the employee manual, don't talk that way. Right? A real left would have to disregard all of that completely, throw all of that out the window. Because actually people are not that racist in the world. It's just not, it's just, yeah. So, in other words, it's less of an obstacle than people imagine it to be. So, I think that's really, in other words, as we move into a new phase of history, because capitalism always changes, that's how it keeps itself going. It has to constantly revolutionize itself. We have to assume that actually we can't assume anything. In other words, that we can't be backward looking, which is what politics and capitalism usually is. It's what ideology usually is. And it's also what the left usually is. So the left spent 40 years resisting neoliberalism. And now they're going to spend the next 40 years resisting post-neoliberalism. Right? In other words, they now want to go back to pre-neoliberalism. They want to go back to like a 50s and 60s style welfare state, like state capitalist economy. That's not going to happen. And then they'll spend the next 40 years wanting to go back to whatever we had before fascism. Right? That's not going to happen. So we just have to be open to the possibilities, right? Not be blinkered, not be blindsided by history, not be ideologically obscurantist, right? Which is essentially what the left amounts to. And by that I mean like the rad lib, shading into just liberal, and Democratic Party type stuff. Because you'll notice that like the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Atlantic, the New Republic, they're getting on board with all the latest leftist trendy stuff, right? So they're adopting this hypertrophic language of, because you would never have the New York Times say before Trump was elected that America is white supremacist. They would never have said that, right? And so, and of course what white supremacist means is not that the country is run by the KKK, because that's what that should mean, but they mean something entirely different, right? So you'll notice that all of the kind of hardcore leftism is now being adopted by the capitalists and by the management. Like they have no problem assimilating this stuff. And so a true left would have nothing to do with any of that at all. Right. Acquaintance of mine on the left once recently formulated it as, what was it? It was really great. Cis heteropatriarchy. He had like one word that captured everything. And I was like, yeah, that's never going to go anywhere. It's just not. You're not going to be able to organize people that way at all. Zilch.
So you were just talking about, and you've been kind of teasing out a lot of this. I guess you mentioned earlier the allowance of a progressive era to like signify a need for socialism, a mass need for it. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask if you could go, and you already are, but go in further with the anti-oppressionists versus the anti-exploitationists, or the sort of like the like you were just saying, the radical liberal democratic agenda of using maybe anti-exploitation as a distraction from a maybe it is a distraction, maybe not. I don't know. How would you?
No, it's not a distraction. What it is it's real. In other words, there are different ways of organizing people. And so the Democratic Party going back to the 19th century is based on cultural, communitarian type organizing. So they were the party of the Irish immigrants when the United States was very anti-Catholic, anti-Irish, right, in the 19th century. Right, so the riots during the Civil War by Irish people going around killing black people because they didn't want to be drafted into the Union Army to fight against slavery in the Civil War. That's the Democrats. Right, so they're based on these machines. And what they've done is, through the New Left, they've expanded the machines so that now you have a kind of ethno-cultural communitarianism that is not strictly like racial or ethnic, but can also include like women and sexual minorities like LGBTQ as ethno-cultural constituencies. They can have that model. So that's available as a form of politics in capitalism. In other words, capitalism drives people into competition against each other. And one of the ways that people can respond to that is by seeking group advantage against other groups. And so that's just a kind of spontaneously, and it's not just in the United States, right? So you see it everywhere. So what the left did in the 20th century, in the 1930s, because that's really the model, right? The 1930s is our model for like Marxism, leftism, really Stalinism, is that they pondered the question of anti-exploitation and anti-oppression. Like that's the language of the 1930s. So they basically said, well, the difference between communists and social democrats, because there was a split in Marxism in which Marxism divided between social democrats and communists. So social democrats were seen as the reformist Marxists, and the communists were seen as the radical, or saw themselves as the radical Marxists. And so what they said was, we can't base the struggle for socialism purely on anti-exploitation. We also have to base it on anti-oppression. Right, so that's where we get that kind of language from. And of course, one of the features of like the Communist Party in the 1930s in the United States and the 1940s is that they aligned with the Democratic Party. Right, so in other words, that was like their way of addressing, well, the struggle for socialism is not just about higher wages and better working conditions for working class people. It's also for the democratic rights of minorities, anti-oppression. It's also for things like, women's equality, and they were taking up those kinds of issues that can't be addressed through labor organizing per se, but have to be addressed the way they would call it is other democratic struggles. Right, have to come under the leadership of socialists or communists. But what that meant in practice was adapting to the way the working class and oppressed communities oriented towards capitalist politics. And so starting in the 1930s, you had this orientation where the left saw itself as trying to be the left pole of attraction or peeling people off from what they considered to be progressive capitalist politics. So the idea is that communists would be the best fighters, the most militant and the most principled fighters for black rights in the United States, for example. And not just be the best and most militant and principled fighters for the working class in its labor organizing, right? So that was the idea. Now, of course, that was difficult to pull off precisely because it meant competing with the Democratic Party itself for how to unify these different struggles. So I mentioned before the New Deal coalition in the United States, the scars of which, the historical trauma of which, still run deep. Right? So when Ta-Nehisi Coates said the New Deal was white supremacist, right? Famously, he said the New Deal was white supremacist. That's opening up all the old wounds of the New Deal coalition. The fact that the New Deal was based on the Dixiecrats supporting it, meaning Southern Democrats who were the architects of Jim Crow segregation, the crazy racists. They were fundamental to FDR being able to implement the New Deal, right? And so, again, what that suggests, and you find this on the left, you find this with like the DSA, for example, is that it imitates the Democratic Party. It sets up women's caucuses, LGBTQ caucuses, people of color caucuses, in the same way the Democratic Party sets up these caucuses within its organizing structure, within its political structure, so that politics becomes a negotiation of different interest groups to negotiate a common program, right? So that, again, because the only real progressive capitalist achievement in US history is the New Deal, and then its expansion in the 60s with the Great Society. Because of that, there's a kind of haunting memory of the price that had to be paid for it. Right? In other words, there's a question in people's minds whether in order for the white working class to get the welfare state, black people had to suffer racism. Like, that's what it boils down to. And there are people, again, prominent public intellectuals who are there to say, yes, exactly. Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? He's like, Bernie is bad because he's calling for a return to the welfare state, which was white supremacist. But then as he was pressed on it, he said, but of course I'm going to vote for Bernie anyway, right? So he said, I'm going to vote for Bernie anyway because it doesn't matter because the US has always been white supremacist, it is white supremacist, and it always will be white supremacist. So yes, Bernie's a white supremacist, but so is everybody, and so it doesn't matter, right? But really, what the argument did was make it harder for Bernie to get votes from minorities. Yes, because it put in people's heads, oh, what is this really about? Who is he really appealing to? Are we really going to be dependent on these crazy crackers, right? Anyway, so we don't have like a good model of progressive capitalist politics in the United States, at least, that's not tinged with compromises with rotten social reality and capitalism, right? So it looks like, oh, in order to get the welfare state, you have to suppress. Or the mid-20th century, it looks like to have a full employment economy with high wages, you have to have sexism. You have to keep women in the home or something, right? Because this is how people associate it. Now, of course, that's not literally true, but this is what people think. And the left replicates that. The left keeps that mindset going, right, as sort of mini-me Democrats.
So, do you think that the this focus on anti-oppression or identity politics, whatever that, however you term that component, I mean, do you think that it's become adopted by some on the left or the more capitalist-leaning left because it simply, well, one, it can be monetized, and number two, it's not really challenging to the actual things that structure power, like the most core factors like wealth, money. I mean,
I would say it does challenge power, but in certain ways, right? I wouldn't say that it's just like a way of channeling discontent in a way that doesn't challenge power, because it does challenge power. It might even challenge capitalist power in certain ways. It might. In other words, it might force companies and capitalists to do things that they're not inclined to do. It might. I mean, certainly, it took a while for corporate America to become PC. Now it's totally PC, by the way. So I mentioned my partner. So he works for a major capitalist corporation, and they are completely PC, right? They have it all. They have diversity training on neurodivergence, right? Like they've got it all. Like they're in the forefront, everything, right? So they were way out ahead in terms of trans and gay stuff. Like they were totally in the vanguard. Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of is that like a plot against the workers? Not intentionally, right? It is a form of labor discipline. It definitely is a form of labor discipline. But what they really wanted was to be a more efficient capitalism. In other words, they didn't want to cut themselves off from any resources in terms of employees and in terms of markets, or, it's
exactly.
Like sincere.
So those things can be subsumed and almost form like a symbiosis without causing the structures to really fall apart. I guess what I'm saying is kind of like maybe something about the causality, where like it kind of exists because it didn't cause something to fall apart. It actually bolstered it.
Yes. All right. So here's another thing that I'll say, and I'll sound like a total conservative now, right? Maybe the goal is not to make things fall apart, right? So when I first lived in Chicago in the 1990s, I moved here, and then I had an old professor, Adolph Reed, who moved out here around the same time I moved out here, just so happened. And so we ran into each other on the street, and it's like, oh, you're here, oh, you're here, and anyway. And he was doing leftist activism in Chicago and tried to get me involved. So he's a black political scientist. He was at Northwestern, and then he was at UIC, and then finally he left Chicago. The 90s, when I was living here, was another boom period, right? And the big issues for the left, but also for the Democrats in Chicago, or at least in some mixed way, was they had anti-big box stores, right? So they were trying to keep Walmart out, right? That was the big thing. And my perspective on that was, why do you want to keep Walmart out? Meaning you bring Walmart in and then you organize Walmart, right? But they didn't kind of get that. In other words, that the point is not to like destroy Walmart. The point is to use it as an organizing opportunity. Meaning if big box stores are going to come in and hire thousands of workers and put all little small businesses out of business, well, guess what? That makes it a lot easier to organize people. So you should welcome it, right? But of course, that's not where people are coming from. People are into resistance to capitalism and protecting local business and right? All that is just whatever, nonsense. So, in other words, small capitalism is not better than big capitalism. Or the way that I like to put it is exploitation begins at home, meaning mom and pop stores are the most exploitative, right? So, no, you want people to not work for their family. You want people to work for huge anonymous corporations, right? Like that's like society, right? As opposed to tribes. And so especially we have to reckon with this. In other words, maybe not, but maybe we are moving into a boom period. In other words, there are going to be new kinds of jobs. So at that time, it was about, these low-wage jobs, the service sector, the hyper-exploitation of the working class. Like, people were bemoaning this. And it's like, but what if that just is the way it's going to be? So you're going to spend 20 or 40 years saying, no, we're going to resist that? Marxism, and this is where I'll, put aside the leftism and forefront the Marxism, is about turning capitalism into socialism. It's not about destroying capitalism. It's about transforming it into socialism. And that means you have to address capitalism where it's happening, right? And again, that doesn't sound like particularly revolutionary or radical. But what I always like to say is, actually, capitalism is more revolutionary than you are. Capitalism is more radical than you are. So it's not just about it being co-opting and subsuming. It's actually more revolutionary than we could ever be. So as Lenin put it, the task is to be as radical as reality itself. Right? In other words, capitalism's an opportunity. That's what it is. It's also a task, meaning it will destroy itself. We don't need to destroy capitalism. Capitalism will destroy itself, but that's also how it keeps itself going, meaning it will destroy itself in order to pick itself back up again. We have two models for the left in the history of the United States, and there's a kind of schizophrenia around it. We have a 30s model and we have a 60s model. We have a 1930s model, which is a model of the left benefiting from capitalist crisis and from immiseration, from poverty. So we have a kind of Great Depression, like salt of the earth, grapes of wrath kind of image of capitalism, that when that happens, then like the people get together and do good things. But we also have the 60s New Left model, which is discontent with prosperity. Right, what Marcuse called the revolt against affluence. And actually what we need is both and neither of those. In other words, we don't need a rejection of consumerism and revolt against affluence and a kind of existential ennui at like prosperity, like, the movie Revolutionary Road, the movie Revolutionary Road about people moving to the suburbs and losing their minds out of prosperity. We don't need that kind of beatnikism, hipsterism, right? But we also don't need the salt of the earth stuff, which is that as people get poorer, they get more radical. In other words, we need to build for socialism under conditions of bust or boom, and under conditions of right-wing politics or progressive politics, or so-called progressive politics. The task is to find the opportunities in capitalism, because after all, there's nothing else, right? Because that's the other bad legacy from the 30s and the 60s is the idea that somehow there's an outside of capitalism, that you resist capitalism from the standpoint of outside of it. And that's also fallacious because, again, even if there was an outside of capitalism, that wouldn't actually be the best place to try to build socialism. It wouldn't, right? Unless you like your Khmer Rouge type regimes or Idi Amin type regimes, right? Or those kinds of projects, right? Which are real, right? Again, they came from an authentic place, but didn't go anywhere, right? In terms of socialism. So that's the other challenge. In other words, the challenge to not be anti-capitalist. Or not be merely anti-capitalist, I should say.
Chris, following what Peter said, so what do you think about why don't capitalism want to absorb immigrants as part of its power as it did with the leftists?
They do.
They do?
Of course they do.
Oh.
Don't think that immigration is going to stop. In other words, if Trump builds his wall, that's not going to stop illegal immigrants. It's just going to put them in a more desperate place, in a more exploitable place, right? And by the way, so what does Trump want on that issue? He wants the same thing that Obama wanted, and he's trying to get it the same way Obama tried to get it, which is putting the pressure on through like raids and deportations, right? In other words, what they're trying to do is force the capitalists to force the politicians to pass immigration reform. But immigration reform is going to suck because right now you have a two-tiered workforce. You have legals and illegals. So what they want from immigration reform is a guest worker program. In other words, they want a three-tiered workforce instead of a two-tiered workforce. So they want like citizens, they want guest workers, and then they'll have illegals, right? Because there will still be, there always are. So in terms of, that's not to say that like Trump isn't bad or something, right? But it's that he doesn't want anything different than the Democrats, actually. And so the Democrats simply lie when they say that they're looking out for the immigrants. No, right? And there's a real there's a lack of a capitalist and management consensus on what immigration reform should actually look like. And also it's become a wedge issue between the two parties. So the two parties have become attached to keeping the issue alive, meaning you don't want to get rid of the issue, you don't want to solve the issue, because then you'll lose a wedge issue to distinguish yourself from your opponents. It's like the way they keep abortion alive as an issue. Right? So every election, the Supreme Court, Roe v. Wade, right? My whole life, every election was the apocalypse, right? Every single election. No, this time they really are going to do it, right? But in the meantime, of course, abortion has become more and more regionally isolated and less available in large parts of the country, right? So it's nominally legal, but also unavailable. I think American medical schools don't teach the procedure. Do you guys know that? In the United States, if you go to medical school, you're not taught the procedure. So a lot of the doctors who perform abortions are not taught in the United States. They bring in doctors who are taught overseas to do it. So it's like a crazy, and again, both the Democrats and the Republicans want to keep the issue because they can get votes, right? And I'm afraid that immigration has long since proved itself to be just that. And so Trump was naive enough to say, oh, well, the Democrats and the Republicans have both been trying to get this immigration reform, and so let's just do it, right? And what you found was that the Republicans were like, wait, we didn't really mean it. And the Democrats were like, no, definitely not, right?
Yeah, I did receive an email saying that the H-1B visa, the immigration visa, is a historical high point this year.
Well, that's where post-neoliberalism, it's unclear. In other words, it's actually unclear whether, the patterns of immigration of the last, period will continue. They probably will continue to a large extent, but not necessarily, right? So they can make changes. They can make changes to basically the quota system for allotment of certain work visas. They can do that. And I guess people have tried to trace that. They've been like, oh, well, Silicon Valley depends upon all these Indians and blah, blah, blah. In other words, people think that there's some kind of master plan to the whole thing. There are different interest groups that have different priorities in terms of immigration. And so that's one of the things that they have to concoct. They have to come up with some recipe for meeting all the different capitalists' requirements. But I don't think it's a matter of are there going to be immigrants or not, right? It's not like that. There definitely are going to be. So that's the other thing is that, yeah, it's just demagogy, right? So maybe we'll wrap on that note. One more. Sarmeen? Oh no. Anthora. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, I really don't know if I have myself collected or formulated to ask such a question. But we're here to learn, right? You're here to teach us that we're wrong or something, or uneducated. So I am just curious as thinking about okay, if you're a disenchanted youth being well, all infrastructure is trash, what I feel
what
yeah.
Brecht said, the world is made of dog shit. Bertolt Brecht. Trademark. No.
Trademarked as fuck. Yeah, and so I'm just curious as where where you stand with why not Warren or why not Bernie or why not Trump for the say upkeeping and also dismantling of current infrastructure.
Okay, so I will say that I did like the destruction of the old Republican Party by Trump. That's cool to watch, right? But that's not like a serious political consideration, right? And yeah, why not Bernie? Why not Warren? Why not whomever, right? Why not Buttigieg?
Why not Yang?
Well, why not Yang? Yeah, Yang Gang, sure. In other words, why not Tulsi Gabbard? Meaning, I wish that Trump had made her the national security advisor because he interviewed her for that, right? What he'll do instead is he'll have Nikki Haley as his vice presidential nominee next year. And then he'll win the white suburban women vote or whatever. Whatever they talk about demographics. It's again possible that one of these progressives will get the nomination and win the presidency. It's possible. It's possible. And that would be interesting. That would be a different drama, right? You'd see a different kind of drama in Congress, in American politics. That would be interesting. I just don't think it's going to get that far. I thought that Bernie could have gotten the nomination last time, actually. I didn't think that he was likely to, but I thought it was very possible. And that would have been interesting. And in fact, people do have this idea that if it had been Bernie, he would have won against Trump. That's also quite possible. Quite possible. It's also possible that Trump would have totally, would have just wiped Bernie out, right? That's possible too. In other words, a lot of people who voted for Hillary would not have voted for Bernie. That's just true. So all of these things are in the realm of possibility and would be interesting. I just don't see the fault lines reaching that far. In other words, the Democrats have convinced themselves that it was an accident in 2016, that demographics are on their side, right? They have this demographics as destiny idea. In other words, as the country becomes less white, the Democrats become inevitable. And my response to that is, it depends on what you mean by white, because there's no reason why Asians and Latinos can't become white. In the grand scheme of things, they'll just join the white population. Or there's just going to be black, Latino, Asian conservatives, which there already are, right, who will be Republicans, and that's that. So they do have this kind of idea that makes it, as long as they're kind of convinced of that, it makes them immune to certain more interesting developments. Wasn't it just reported this week that Obama was prepared to step in and, put the kibosh on Bernie or Warren? I think that, you guys didn't hear about this? He was going to intervene to prevent Warren or Sanders from getting the nomination. I don't know what that would mean. I guess he just thinks he could smooth talk it into I don't know, because.
Yeah, he also said fuck infrastructure.
Right. So, all those things are hypothetically possible. It's possible that something happens to Trump. The interesting thing is that the Republicans can't win without Trump. So he's got that on lock, right? That's done. They can't win without him. And there's no one coming up who's going to be able to be a Trumpist. He doesn't have any Trumpists. He has Jared and Ivanka, and that's it, pretty much. So they're stuck with him. The Democrats are still figuring things out, and I think that they won't really have a reckoning until after another 4 years of Trump. And maybe not even then. It took the Democrats a while to get with it after Reagan, with Clinton. It took them 12 years to figure it out. So it will probably the Democrats are more of a real party than the Republican Party. That's the other thing. Like, the American political parties are not real political parties, really, but the degree to which they are at all, the Democrats are a more actual political party than the Republicans. And so they're slower to change. That's it. But that's why socialism has nothing to do with that, right? It has nothing to do with that. Because if you wait for the Democrats to change, it will either never happen, or by the time it happens, it will be irrelevant. Right, because all the radical new leftism became dominant Democratic Party ideology within a generation. And by the time it became a dominant Democratic Party ideology, it was irrelevant as any kind of radical revolutionary force. You know, Van Jones, you know who Van Jones is? He was a Maoist, right? So this is what happens, right? Like, revolutionary Marxists become mainstream Democrats, that's it. Or mainstream Republicans, right? Black Panthers became Republicans too. They didn't only become Democrats. You know, Bobby Rush here is a Democrat, but there were others who became Republicans. So that's the fate. There's a future for you yet, Anthora. Anthora 2040.
I'll be young, I'll be fresh. Malleable.
All right, so see you guys next year. Those of you who I don't have classes with, that I'll see a couple more times anyway.